his total heartlessness for the people that he destroys through his capitalistic endeavors. And so this started me thinking about what really is the meaning of anti-Semitism in Russia today. I wrote an article on this subject 10 years ago that was published in Commentary, but Commentary did not want to publish this article. Neil Kazagoy, the editor, said there is no anti-Semitism in Russia. And finally, it was only because I called the Israeli embassy and I got some poor fellow to admit that, in fact, the Israelis are well aware that there is such a thing as anti-Semitism in Russia, and I can reveal that there was, that he published it. But I had to publish it under a pseudonym. And I understand that there is a lot of resistance to this notion, partly because it's become a kitsch image on the box, on the back of a box of chocolates. But how kitsch is this, and is there any meaning to this kitsch that has relevance and significance that we should take stock of? And I believe that there is. Obviously, the subject of anti-Semitism in Russia is an old one. It goes back centuries and centuries. There's no point in rehearsing all of that now. But I thought that as part of providing a contextual frame for discussion, I would just simply read some things to you that show how problematic, multifaceted, and in many ways ambiguous this subject is. On June 18, 1917, Gorky writes the following in his magazine Novaya Жизнь. Equality for the Jews is one of the wonderful achievements of our revolution. Having recognized the Jew to be equal to the Russian, we have removed a shameful, bloody, and filthy stain from our conscience. There is nothing in this act that gives us the right to be proud. Having freed the Jews from the Jewish Pale, from the bondage of restrictions which disgraced us, we have given our country an opportunity to use the energy of people who know better than we do how to work. And everybody knows that we badly need people who know how to work. This is Gorky in 1917. In 1918, in the same journal, he writes, he quotes a pamphlet that is being circulated by the Christian Socialist Party that begins, "Anti-Semites of all countries, all parties, and all peoples unite." And it goes on. The Union of Christian Socialists addresses all Russian citizens with an appeal to cleanse themselves from that Judaic foulness that has permeated our land, from the uppermost strata to the lowest levels of the masses. Markedly afflicted with this foulness is our intelligentsia, our so-called educated society brought up on the Judaic press, which preaches the false principles of equality and brotherhood of all peoples and races. But every intelligent person knows there is not either equality or brotherhood, and consequently there cannot be a single attitude toward all people and toward all nationalities. And this outrageous, of course. On July 6, 1921, Lenin receives a memorandum from a field worker for the NKVD in Ukraine. In part, the memo is as follows, sent to the Politburo. Quote, Jewish farmers in Kovshets advise that neighboring peasants believe that the attacks and pogroms against the Jews are made with the knowledge of the Soviet government, and this contributes to an increase in the number of bandits. The question of arming trade union members with the active participation of the People's Commissariats and the Jewish section should be resolved without delay, because the Jewish population is being systematically exterminated and compelled to attend to its own self-defense. This is not 1943. This is 1921 in Russia. Lenin took this memorandum and he simply filed it. There was no follow-up whatsoever to this. And I read these because clearly, and I don't need to repeat to you this long, sad story of it, for the Christian socialists, the Jews are the communists who preach brotherhood and equality. And for the communists, the Jews are the capitalists who are the common enemy. And what do we make of this? And one might say, as some of my friends do in Russia today, that really the people are not anti-communist, anti-Semitic at all. And there's some justification to that. But to show how resistant this anti-Semitism in Russia is, I found this. This is the pamphlet of the Russian Fascist Party, the swastika, glory to Russia, underneath, exclamation point, Moscow 1993. And they reproduce the frontispiece of a journal called Nazia that was published in 1937. Imagine, 1937, at the height of the purges, when 950,000 people were arrested from the party alone, were arrested, the height of the purges. They were publishing this magazine. And it's of the Russian worker with a hammer in his hand smashing the snake. And you have to read very carefully what this snake, what it says in the snake. It says, Udo-communism, Judeo-communism, Judeo-communism. The Jews are responsible. The Jews are responsible. When quite recently, when one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Moscow sent a letter to the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, begging that the church repudiate the protocols of the elders of Zion, the patriarch wrote in a letter published in a variety of newspapers the following. He said, "I'm not a scholar. I don't know whether these are true or not true. But I know one thing, which is that the protocols of the elders of Zion contain a deep spiritual truth, and therefore I will not repudiate them." This is from the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I will tell you an anecdote, which may really be shocking to some of you. Yale University Press, or all of you, it should be, Yale University Press published in 1997, I believe, or 1998, the last diary of Alexandra Fyodorovna, the Tsaritsa, that ends several hours before the family is executed. And we got Robert Massey to write the introduction to the book. And he did a fine job. And at that time, Robert Massey was also doing a book on the DNA analysis of the bones that were found in the mine shaft. And he concluded that the entire family had been, in fact, executed and so on and so forth. Well, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Boston wanted to meet with Massey to talk about this investigation, because at precisely that time, the imperial family, the Romanov family, was being, a debate was going on as to whether they should be canonized. So I had been reading about this in the Russian press, and I wanted to ask this church father what his view of the matter was. And so we were gathered in one of the seminar rooms here at Yale. Robert Massey was there, I was there, the father of the church was there, and various of his attendants were there. And I asked him how the process of canonization was going, and he said, well, it's going slowly. And I said, why? I knew why. but I wanted to hear what he said. He said, well, we have to investigate the causes of death. I said, really? What's the problem? Well, was the family murdered by a mob? Was it a state execution? Or was it a ritual murder? And I was delighted because this is exactly what the debate in Moscow has been. And so I said to him disingenuously, I said, well, what do you mean by ritual murder? And he said, well, that's when the Jews will take a Gentile child and take its blood and make their matzahs out of it. And he did not put this in the past tense. And Robert Massey went utterly ballistic. Nobody knew what to say. But this is what happened here in a seminar room at Yale no more than 8 years ago. These traditions of thinking are deeply embedded institutionally. They are deeply embedded culturally. They are deeply embedded politically. When in 1952 Stalin was preparing the doctor's plot and the trial of the Jewish doctors, he interrogated two men, two Jews, who were in the KGB, the MGB at the time, a man named Schwarzman and a man named Groverman. Groverman was very brilliant, and he had something called Groverman's Kitchen. Whenever the head of the KGB needed to have a document cooked, he'd give it to Groverman and he'd cook it for him. They called it Groverman's Kitchen. Anyway, poor Groverman was now wound up in the doctor's plot because all of the Jews in the MGB were being interrogated, thrown out, put in jail, and so forth. And Groverman, during the interrogation, said the following. Schwarzman said the following. Groverman and I referred contemptuously to Russians and in every way praised Jews, elevating their intelligence and abilities, declaring in this regard that really, by their history, Jews were chosen to rule the world. Schwarzman says, which is straight out of the protocols of the elders. Wait. Groverman, in his testimony, says the following. In conversation with Schwarzman, Schwarzman and I often poured out our hearts to each other and maliciously slandered the existing Soviet order. We spoke with scorn about Russians and other nationalities and in every way elevated Jews for their alleged outstanding intelligence and ability. Enveloped by the nationalistic poison, we agreed to the blind conviction that Jews, by virtue of their alleged special qualities of intelligence, were called upon by history to rule the world. Now, clearly, this is under duress. Clearly, their testimony is being guided by the MGB. Clearly, this is being prepared for a show trial where these two officers, both deputy assistants, deputy heads of the KGB, are going to testify that there is a Jewish plot not only to destroy the Soviet Union and to murder Stalin, but to rule the world. And so that fat man sitting on top of the Parliament building will eventually have all the power. As part of this scheme, the chief investigator of the doctor's plot was a man, a real devil, one of these little devils in the Soviet system, but nevertheless quite devilish. M.D. Ruman, his name was. And he said to one of the KGB officers during interrogation, he said, listen, this is in February 1952, he said, listen, in Moscow, there live more than 1.5 million Jews. They have seized the medical posts, the legal profession, the union of composers, the writer, the union of writers. I'm not even speaking of the trade networks. Meanwhile, of these Jews, only a handful are useful to the state. All the rest are potential enemies of the state, especially if you consider that in Moscow are to be found all the foreign embassies, foreign correspondents, etc., etc. So the Jews are not being viewed here as a racial group to be eliminated, but they are enemies of the people And what makes this particularly threatening, you see, in 1952, which is why the doctor's plot has got to be taken seriously. This is not that these Jews are working to subvert the government because they're unhappy with the government or undermine Stalin. They are in the pay of the Americans. They are a third column. As such, they are an enemy of the state in a way that is quite different from somebody who just says to his wife in his kitchen, well, I think Stalin should go to hell. And so this was a mass phenomenon. And the question is today, to what extent is this over? Clearly a box of chocolates like this is meant to elicit a laugh. You're supposed to laugh when you see this. You're supposed to say, well, it's over, it's done. All these things are of the past. But in Russia, it is not of the past. It is not of the past when Putin redesigns the plaque in Volgograd, and he changes it from the Battle of Volgograd back to the Battle of Stalingrad. And people like Alexander Yakovlev recognize this as a slow rehabilitation of Stalin. And Stalin, for those of you who have not been to Russia lately, you may be surprised to know, is enjoying an extraordinary renaissance. He is being rehabilitated in thousands of books. A book published not long ago, Stalin in the Embrace of His Family. These charming letters between him and his wives, him and his daughter. Pictures of them taking picnic trips with Berry on their boat. A lovely family group, and so on and so forth. There was recently an exhibit at the Museum of the Revolution that I went to, in which it was, who was Stalin? Who was Stalin? Well, Stalin was the captain of the country of Soviets. He built Belomor Canal. He industrialized the nation. And as it said, it lifted us up. It lifted up the Russian nation. He lifted up the Russian nation, made us a great power. At the end of World War II, they had the strongest military in the world. That's what he did. Of course he made some mistakes. And this is what everybody then adds as a sort of parenthetical clause. Of course he made some mistakes. Of course. Not everybody has to be killed, I suppose. But these were mistakes. The idea was the right idea. The idea was the right idea. And the thing that we have to understand about this brew, because it's a brew, is that Stalin, anti-Semitism, rejection of the West, these are all part of the same gestalt. At a time when Russia is moving forward at a breakneck speed economically. Moscow is now, by all accounts, the most expensive city in the world. More expensive than New York City. Real estate is more expensive in Moscow than in New York. You see the most elaborate and extraordinary skyscrapers going on. You see the most beautifully dressed people. You see sushi bars, things that were unimaginable 10 years ago in downtown Moscow. These extraordinarily dressed 14-year-olds walking down the street with these cell phones plastered to their ear, looking in shop windows that should be lining Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue. It's amazing. You say to yourself, if that's all you see, well, Russia has changed. Russia has changed for the better. Russia is moving forward into a capitalistic society. Yes, except that in the countryside, it is so depopulated that when the old ladies, because their men have all died, When the old ladies have to harvest their potatoes, there's nobody to carry the heavy sacks into the cellars. This has been written about. For every 10 women, there are 7 men. Of the 7 men, 3 are drunks. It's not a laughing matter, in fact. Why? Because they fear depopulation. They have a negative birth rate. Everybody knows this. The canals, the streams, the rivers, the air, the ground, everything is polluted. They talk about, now, I'll meet you at the border of China and Finland. This is a Russian joke. I'll meet you at the border of China and Finland. And it's a joke, but underlying it is a deep cultural anxiety. An anxiety that they are losing something. They are losing the greatness of Russia. That's what they're losing. They're losing the greatness of Russia. And for pipsqueak, Ukraine, to all of a sudden stand up on its hind legs and start barking and say, we are a nation, is an offense to all Russian nationalists. And in fact, Putin is on record very recently as saying, we shall reconstitute the borders of Russia. He doesn't say when. We shall reconstitute the borders of Russia, but without the ideology. But without the ideology. And Putin is moving very carefully in all of these respects. Why? Because there are these nationalists who are responding to this cultural anxiety. The anxiety of losing their nation. You have no idea. Babel writes in his diary about being in Budyonny's army and coming upon a hospital run by Jews in Ukraine, and the Cossacks smashing everything and so on and so forth. And the cry goes up among the Cossacks, smash the Yids, save Russia. Kill the Yids and save Russia. And you can see that on walls on apartment buildings today in downtown Moscow. These things do not die so easily. And they particularly do not die when there is a culture, as is the case in Russia today, that is caught in this very strange historical moment. This moment of moving forward at breakneck speed, where you see the most expensive BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes and SUVs of every sort barreling down Kutuzovsky Prospect at 50 miles an hour, and you don't dare walk across these intersections because they will not stop for you. When that is going on the one hand, and people do not even have paper money in the countryside, it is so impoverished on the other. This is an extremely explosive situation. And this is the situation that Putin has inherited. He has not made this. And his solution to this situation, to the situation of a fragmenting, disintegrating Russia, which he inherited from Yeltsin, is to do what? It's to do the age-old Russian thing, which is build the center. Build the center. Centralize. And that's what he did. In 1994, I believe it was, Lenin, all of a sudden, who was governor of Krasnoyarsk, declares, I am nationalizing all the industry in Krasnoyarsk. Can you imagine? It would be like the governor of the state of Texas saying, okay, from now on, Conoco and Exxon and Mobil and everything, it's national. We're nationalizing the banks, we're nationalizing this, and Yeltsin did nothing to stop this. There was not a peak, nothing. The country was falling apart. It was falling apart because of this sort of thing that was going on. At that time, no more than 13% of the Russian population was paying income tax. And even Alexander Yakovlev, when I went to visit him in his office, and I said to him, because we've made a business deal for Yale Press, I said to him, Alexander Nikolaevich, how am I to pay you? Normally, I would go to Moscow like a Mexican bandit with $100 bills under my shirt. And I knew my life was not nearly worth the amount of money I was carrying on any street corner. But that was the only way I could pay people. But I said to him, I said, Alexander Nikolaevich, I'm not going to pay you this way. I cannot carry $40,000 in cash on my person. It's too dangerous. He said, well, we'll have to figure out a way. I said, can't I send you a check or wire it? He said, wire it? Are you kidding? If you wire it into my account, those criminals in the Kremlin will take 90% of it. He said, I am a true Russian patriot. I lost the use of one of my legs in the war. I will go to my death for Russia, but I will not give a kopeck to those people in the Kremlin. Not one kopeck. And this is from Alexander Yakovlev, who was second to Gorbachev. And this tells you that the anomie, the disintegration, the fragmentation in this society is very real and very dangerous. And Putin is doing everything he possibly can to keep it under control. He's like a man at an organ. But he's not just playing with his hands and his feet. It's like he's got 5 feet and 12 hands. And he's constantly playing every lever he can possibly play. And these symbols, the chimpanzee with the yarmulke and the payas, and Stalin, and this rich Jew, these are sort of floating around right now in this alphabet soup that is political, social, economic. As somebody said to me, a Pole said to me recently, had gone back to Krakow, where there are a few Jews left. He said, you know, the Jew, they don't even know what Jews are in Poland any longer. But if you act in such and such and such a way, whether you're Jewish or not, you become a Jew. And in a way, that is also the case in Russia today. The Jew has become a symbol that has still got tremendous power to unite certain elements, certain aspects of that country. It seems to me, and I'll close here, it seems to me our government and our educational institutions are by no means doing enough to try to understand what is going on. I learned just yesterday that Putin has nationalized Conoco. Can you believe this? Nationalized Conoco. The Conoco oil company has been nationalized. They have lost all of their assets in Russia because they violated some regulation, supposedly, some quote-unquote environmental regulation for drilling oil in the Far East. And so it's been nationalized. It was not for nothing. Can you imagine? Nobody really remarked on this when Putin showed up in New York City at a gas station to open the first gas station in America. It was an extraordinary thing. Everybody thought, well, it's a goodwill visit by the president of Russia and so on and so forth. But no, it wasn't that. It was like this. It was Putin laying claim to that gas station, and every drop that flowed from that gas station all the way back to where they're drilling it. And this is a serious global situation. Europe certainly does not appreciate what is going on in Russia. And I don't think America does either. Antisemitism is playing a role in this. It isn't, I would say, racial. It's entirely political at this point. But it's undoubtedly a role that is going to have repercussions, I am certain, in the future. At the end of his book, Yakovlev, in his memoir, which is called Twilight, he has a plea to Putin. A personal letter that he wrote to Putin, and he said to me, he was very nervous about including this, because he was sure that there would be repercussions for it. He died before the book actually appeared. But in this personal plea to Putin, he begs him to do away with conspiratorial political processes, with secretive government, with oligarchical structures, and open up Russia. At the G8 meeting, Putin managed to delight the world when he said to Bush, "You say you want democracy in Russia. I say to you, we don't want democracy in Russia as you've made it in Iraq." But what he didn't say was what democracy in Russia is going to look like. And he has never said it. But if you take the analysis of Yakovlev seriously, and if you look at both the history and the present day, there are 220 anti-Semitic fascist newspapers publishing openly in Russia today. 220. When a bill came before the Russian parliament some years back, not that long ago, to declare a moment of silence for the victims of the Holocaust, it was overruled. 120 deputies voting against and 114 for. When the same group wanted the parliament, the Duma, to make a declaration that against anti-Semitism, that too was voted down in the Duma, partly because of the vociferous lobbying of Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who's a Jew. So I will end there.
Did the nationalization of Conoco go through then?
As far as I know, it went through yesterday. And it's astonishing. I didn't even see it referred to in the New York Times, but maybe it's in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, I was curious, you haven't really tied the anti-Semitic movement to Putin. Is there a connection there or not?
I don't think Putin is anti-Semitic. I think he's like tofu. I think he will absorb whatever juices he's put in. And if the juice is an anti-Semitic one, well, he comes from the KGB. He will make use of it. Because he has only one idea, and it is the great idea. The idea of uniting Russia, the great Russian nation, again, from Kamchatka to the Baltic, and so forth. And many of you probably know the great toast that Stalin gave in November 1937, or 38 and 37, in which he said, "The Tsars were guilty of many things, comrades, but they did one thing that was good. They united Russia from the Baltic to the Pacific Ocean. They gave us that, comrades, and that is what we must protect. And anybody who challenges that is an enemy of the state. And we will destroy him, and we will destroy his family, and we will destroy his friends for what they do as well as for what they think." Huge cheer goes on. But this is what emboldens these Russian nationalists. That's what is fundamentally at the ground of those newspapers that I'm passing around. That's what they want. That's what they want. They want that greatness again. And that's why their cultural situation is so complex. Because the wealth that is pouring into the country, that they see in the new buildings that are going up, and in the automobiles that people are driving, and in the clothes of the younger generation who have never even heard of Stalin and don't know which end is up as far as communism is concerned. What people in the older generation see is a betrayal of those values. And they are more interested in those values than they are in that wealth. And this puts them in this very odd state. But among those values that were treasured, that represented the old Russia, the great Russia, was anti-Semitism. So Putin will do whatever he has to do. There's no question.
I gather the point you're making is that the nationalism, which is redeveloping in the Soviet Union, attaching their attraction to the czars of old and Peter the Great and all that. But somehow the data is an accounting for anti-Semitism that's there. That is, there's a connection between this nationalist interest and would you say something about how you see those two?
Absolutely, because the nationalism represents, as one of the newspapers says, Russia for the Russians. Russia for the Russians. And in this little pamphlet of the Russian communist, the Russian Fascist Party, it spells out very clearly, I've read it very carefully, it spells out clearly what's going to happen to the Jews.
When was that, people?
1993. And what is going to happen to the Jews is very simple. The Jews represent 1% of the population? Fine. It's exactly as Truman said in 1952. It's exactly what he said in 1952. They represent 1% of the population. They should be 1% of the doctors. They should be 1% of the lawyers. They should be 1% of the musicians. They should be 1% of the people in government. And if they got that, and if the Jew would just take his place, sort of as in, the golden age in the Arab world, if you would just stay in your place and not be aggressive and not be arrogant and not be haughty and not work too hard, well, then everything will be all right for you. But once you put your nose up in the air and you think you should be rich, and you think you should be famous, and you think you should be a great violinist or a great prima ballerina, that's trouble. And the problem today, of course, is that who are the oligarchs? Berezovsky, Grushinsky, Khodorkovsky, they're all Jews. Why? I asked my friends, why? How did this pathetic, horrible thing happen? Why aren't there some Russians? He said, well, it's simple. All of these guys were party. They were all in the party. They knew exactly how to take control of their assets. Of course, once the country began to disintegrate, and they did. And they were quick. And just as Gorky said, they're hard workers.
I'm interested that you talked about, well, a couple of things. You talked about what we might think as old or traditional tropes of antisemitism, the protocols, blood libels. Have you seen any evidence of this connecting up to what people have called new antisemitism around anti-Zionist rhetoric around the State of Israel? Because that's certainly the form that antisemitism is taking, for example, in other places.
Right.
And the other thing I'm interested in is this kind of soup. So you kind of pick, a few anecdotes here and there, and you feel something in the ambience, in the air, and it seems to be kind of important, and you feel that this has potential to become something very threatening, but it's kind of untouchable. It's kind of difficult to pin it down. I mean, the anti-Zionist thing is interesting because, as far as I understand, it was invented in the Soviet Union in the 30s or the 40s. What do you know about that? Have you seen any of that around?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the State of Israel, the birth of the State of Israel and the invention of the Doctor's Plot are exactly coincident. They happen at exactly the same time, and not by coincidence. Why? Because Israel became an outpost of the United States. And to the extent that Russia's interests in the Middle East begin to collide with America's interests in the Middle East, we're going to see a greater intensification of that anti-Zionist rhetoric, which has, in fact, heated up over the last few years. And this is a casual reading of their newspapers and so on and so forth. And I don't pretend to have a more systematic understanding of any of this. All of this is based largely on my reading of the newspapers and my experiences with people, both on the street and in certain aspects of government. But the problem of the Jews in 1952 was a political problem. It's wrong to think that it was Stalin, to my mind anyway, that it was Stalin's inveterate anti-Semitism. He wasn't anti-Semitic. But so what? He didn't invent the doctor's plot in the 30s. Maybe he didn't need to. He invented it then because he needed it politically. And, you know, he hated everybody else as well. So I see it, I see the growth of anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist rhetoric in Russia getting hotter as their ties to various other Arab states become stronger. And right at the moment that's happening with Iran, it seems. And it seems to me that Russia is starting to play some of the same games that they played in the Cold War in the Middle East. And that will only spell difficulty for the Jews. But of course there are only 650,000 Jews left in Russia. The number is so insignificant with respect to the rest of the population. It's just now a motif.
You know, it doesn't matter that there are few. Shalom Aleichem wrote about, let there be a few Jews left in Russia for antisemitism.
Right. Well, and then there are the Hasidim who want to go back to Russia and start new communities. So, did that get to your point? Come on.
I have a question. Well, I looked through this really outrageous literature, but there is one question. All of it was published in the years 92, 93, 94.
Yes, that's when I was collecting.
Yes. Were you collecting anything published in 2004, 2005?
I haven't been doing that, but I know from Yakovlev that the very same stuff is being
published.
Absolutely.
Yes. Is it increasing or decreasing?
According to him, there are 220 openly anti-Semitic nationalistic papers as of the year 2004. When I first began looking at this stuff in the early 1990s, I was very avid. I went to all the kiosks. I got about 75 different journals and so on and so forth. And my guess is that it's remained sort of stable. That it's stable. Go ahead. Yes.
Oh, just a quick follow-up. Those chocolates,
Yes.
when were they produced?
I just bought them 2 months ago.
But I mean, that they were actually produced and packaged recently?
Yes.
As opposed to...
That's before. Well, I mean, I never saw these before in the duty-free shop. Never. And I go 2-3 times a year. This seems new.
Those are on sale at the duty-free shop at the airport?
Yes.
What's that? What
For tourists. I'll pass it around.
The chocolate good.
No, that's not terrible. Yes.
Tell me, are the gangsters in Moscow Jewish or not Jewish?
Some are and some aren't.
Who are the most successful?
My connections don't go that deep. And if they did, I wouldn't tell you.
Can you paint a bit of a picture of what's happening in the Jewish community, say, of Moscow and among, say, civic society, human rights organizations? Are people panicked? Are people monitoring?
No.
Are people concerned?
No, people aren't, as far as I know, people are not panicked. It seems like business as usual. And, you know, there are lots and lots of anecdotes, but I have no larger, real sociological picture to give you right now. I think people are just assuming it's Russia the way it's always been.
And why did Putin send Chechens to Lebanon as peacekeepers?
Well, as I told you earlier, I think it was like King David sending Uriah to the front. If he's a hero, wonderful, and if he gets shot, all the better. and they're good fighters. They're good fighters. But the war, this murder of Holokausta is just the most hideous, frightening, and frightful thing. And I have no doubt but that Putin but not Putin, but the people around him, somewhere in that circle, there is a desire to clamp down on freedom of expression. And Yakovlev said to me, and I think he was quite right, he said, wherever two things happen, we know a country is really making a wrong turn, where freedom of expression is attacked and where anti-Semitism goes. He said, those are the two clear warning signs that the culture is in a state of collapse. But what we have to reckon with in the West, I believe, is that Russian culture, Russian civilization is very close to a state of collapse. This is what people talk about there. Partly through simple things like depopulation, losing all of their artists, losing so many of their scientists, losing their institutions of higher education. A professor of history at Moscow State University earns about $150 a month, and a bottle of beer costs $7. What wage? How can you live? How can you live on that? And the opening up of the free market and so on and so forth meant the loss of health care, the loss of educational benefits, the loss of free living, the price of food went up. And so what is all this freedom about? As Eden Michnik said at the New School not long ago about Poland, and I thought this was one of his quips, but nevertheless very insightful. Someone asked, well, what do you think is going to happen to democracy in Poland? He said, oh, democracy, don't worry about democracy. It's absolutely sweet in Poland. Everybody loves democracy, but nobody wants freedom anymore. Nobody wants freedom anymore. And I'm afraid that in Russia, they may not want freedom anymore. Not if they can drive around in big SUVs and Mercedes-Benzes without it.
For a different occasion, but only to make the territory, I think we must distinguish sharply between historical phases and styles of antisemitism in Russia. One is antisemitism before the revolution, with the Chorny, certainly the Black Hundreds, which took an ominous and mythological stance. Second was the antisemitism in the Soviet Union, which inverted. First it started as anti-Bolshevism. Whoever showed anti-Semitic expressions or whatever was sent to Siberia for 8 years. But later Stalin understood it and used it in his service, and I think the purchase in 37, 38 already with a very high percentage of Jews. And that is related to the upcoming of a new class, the Russian peasants, who needed the positions, and the positions were in Jewish hands. And pure in fact, purging the party was purging the Jews in the party to a large extent. Openly he did it only because of political like that. And today there is a strange state that combines the old church Slavonic anti-Semitism, or Chorny, or what do you call it, Russian Orthodox. Right? And now, after Stalin, the new Russian Orthodox Church was a cover for those nationalistic Protestant tendencies. So it's a kind of combination of the two, of the mythological power and then in Soviet Union the political power. And now, I think after the liberation, the democratization, it was a move back to take imagery from the Black Hundreds stage, from the pre-revolutionary stage, and bring it back to the post-revolutionary society.
Well, there is certainly some of it. All of it is in the mix. In Russkie Voskresenie, the Jew in that picture is the old archetype with the big nose and the claws, and clearly goes back to the church stereotype of the Jew as the devil with the tail and so on and so forth. But The Jew sitting on the Parliament building, that's the other Jew, the capitalist Jew, who was also demonized. So there are a lot of pictures of anti-Semitism, and they're floating around in people's minds right now. Where it will all land, we don't know, but it doesn't look very hopeful for me.
Do Russians know how few Jews there are in Russia?
I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know.
the impression is going to be that there are many more than there are just because.
Let me give you one positive piece of news, which is very interesting. I made a connection to a very fine Russian publisher, and after we published the Encyclopedia of the Holocaust, edited by Walter Liqueur, I gave him a copy of it. I said, I think you should have a look at this. And believe it or not, he translated the whole thing into Russian. He raised several hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think from oligarchs, and they published it in Russian. And there was a presentation in the Kremlin with the ambassador of France and the ambassador of Germany in attendance. And it was strongly supported by Putin. And this is one reason to believe that Putin is not an anti-Semite. I don't think he is. I think that he is basically nothing. He's basically whatever he needs to be under the circumstances. A bit. That's why maybe he looked into a soul and he saw. But I think Putin's a little cleverer. But there are positive sides. There are positive things. I think in general the population is not anti-Semitic in this frenzied sort of way that Gorky writes about in Novaya Zhizn. But using it politically is still very much there. It's still very much alive, just as it's being used politically by so many cynical Arab governments.
I have to ask you something. If I went to Russia
Yes.
and I bought this,
Yes.
I would not recognize this figure as representing a Jew.
But if you
And
saw
what is there in there?
saw the Jew, the lips,
Could be any fat
the sensuousness, this is.
No, I disagree with
Well,
you.
maybe.
I wouldn't see that. I would go there.
Okay.
And I would not say, it looks like a character out of the circus.
With his hand on a pile of gold. It's possible. I may be overreading it. That's fine.
Well, but we're
But
not used to seeing anti-Semitic pictures of this country, and they may be seeing many more of them, and that's the typical.
well, they certainly do see.
Yes, and we don't see it here.
When you said that they want to go back to the borders of old Russia, do you mean the borders of the old Soviet Union?
I'm sure that is in the back of Putin's mind. Why else would he turn the gas off to Ukraine and the gas off to Georgia? He's just showing them who's got his hand on the gas pump, you see. Yeah, I mean, that's what he did when he came to the United States. He showed whose hand was on the gas pump.
The date I saw is 2000 or 2006. Were you in 2006?
Yes, I was just there.
The last figure is 0 or 6, so definitely 2000 or 2006.
Well, I just
2006.
I just bought this.
No, that's current.
It's
Yeah.
current.
Yes. Oh, very current.
Actually,
Absolutely.
if you have 2020 publications, probably a lot of Russians are anti-Semites. But I was living in Russia for long years, and general population in Russia is anti-Semites. General population. And you can hear anti-Semitic comments when you are in transport, in metro, and trolley bus, and tramway, everywhere. I live in Moscow, but I can imagine what's going on in provincial towns. So to say that it doesn't affect general population, all of it affects very much. And I know that Jewish people were beaten there. I read in news, in Jewish news, that Jewish people were beaten in Russia. In different, and beaten very
It
hard.
happens, but to be honest, There's anti-Semitism in the United States. There's anti-Semitism here.
Or it's different.
There is.
Or it's
Oh, I
different.
agree with you. I agree that it's different. And part of the reason it's different is that there is such a bloody and hideous history to it. But I sort of picking up what Benjamin said, I think you have to differentiate different kinds of anti-Semitism. And it's, you know, stepping over the line between a personal opinion, distaste, a prejudicial, emotional affect, and actually committing a crime that's an act that is provoked usually by something going wrong in general. For instance, the unbelievable violence that was unleashed in Serbia and in Yugoslavia was not just the result of the fact that the Christians hated the Muslims and so on and so forth. They've been hating each other for years. Why did it happen then? It happened then because the state collapsed. And if this anti-Semitism, and I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm not saying that there isn't, I believe that there is. My closest friend there, who is not Jewish, who collaborated with me on this book, Vladimir Naumov, he said to me once, he said, look, John, have no illusions. Russia is an anti-Semitic country by virtue of its traditions, by virtue of its history, by virtue of its sentiment of the people. Have no illusions. Fine. Given. But when does that anti-Semitism become dangerous? When will it become dangerous? And I believe it becomes dangerous when larger structures begin to collapse. And those are political.
I think that it will become dangerous when it will not be punished.
Well, that's true too, but it won't be punished so long as the government feels that it needs to use that anti-Semitism for political reasons. And it will use that anti-Semitism for political reasons when it feels that it is weak. And right at the moment, Yeltsin is overseeing a weak state. Putin. Yes, it's a weak state.
Could you comment on corruption in Moscow? Is it equally divided?
There's so much of it, it's hardly corruption at all anymore. It's like the air that you breathe. Yeah, I was driving out to my friend's dacha, and I noticed that this very nice car that was next to us got pulled over by militia. And so I said to my friend, now why aren't we being pulled over by the militia? He said, well, why should he pull us over? He sees this car, he knows he says he knows I don't have any money. Why would he do it? This other car was a very nice car. But they'll pull you over and drag you out and demand a bribe. It just is day and night. Day and night. But, you know, David Satter has written a fantastic book called Darkness at Dawn, which is about the coalescence of the corrupt criminality of the organized crime and the government. And the thesis of his book is that it has utterly interpenetrated. And I have no doubt that that's true. Everything is a payoff. Everything is.
I want the government to have such strange memories.
Yes.
It shouldn't be shut
No.
down.
No. The problem is that in Russia they have fewer safeguards against that becoming rampant, against it taking over. We have a more established judiciary. We have a civic society that they don't have. They do not have what we call civic society, civil society.
To the degree that anti-Semitism appears to be associated with both ultranationalism and a nostalgia for the Stalinist era when things were better and Russia was more powerful, can you see any difference among the generations? one would logically think that there might be somewhat less anti-Semitism among the younger generation.
I think, as far as I know, the young people, and I've only met some in St. Petersburg, where I've gone to talk at the Smolny College, for instance. I think they, first of all, most of them have never heard of Stalin. They've heard of Stalin the way kids today have heard of FDR. It's somebody, some shadowy figure in the past who did things, we don't know quite what they were, nobody really wants to talk about it very much, except that all of a sudden there are a lot of books about Stalin coming out, and some are very positive. For instance, this one book on Stalin that I bought recently begins with the line, Stalin did more than any figure in history to establish the greatness of the Russian state, and yet he is the most vilified person in all of history. How can you explain this? But I think the younger people don't care. The younger people want to wear blue jeans, have fancy cell phones.
They don't care about Stalin, or they don't care about Jews.
They don't care about Stalin. They don't care about Jews.
They won't care.
They might. The problem is that they might care. The problem is that they might come to care. If there is economic collapse, and there needs to be an explanation, because obviously we have to have an explanation, and the explanation is that the rich Jews, George Soros did the Jews no good by manipulating the currency in 1996. Yeah. And people know his name very well over there. And Berezovsky has done us no good. And then, of course, as Ruman pointed out, not in that quote that I read, but elsewhere, Ruman of the Doctor's Plot, he pointed out that in the United States, during one of the interrogations, he said, the Jews are astonishing. They wormed their way to the very top of the government in the United States, and they control the media. This is a big thing. This is a very big thing, and this is something that is widely thought to be so in Russia. Two things. One, that the Bolsheviks were Jews, for the most part. And now, of course, the fact that Lenin's Jewish heritage has become completely established. This does not happen. And so the Jews are Bolsheviks, and two, the Jews control the media worldwide. And they can muster statistics to talk about that.
And probably get them here.
And probably get them here, yes, exactly.
Rupert Murdoch is Jewish?
It doesn't, exception that proves wrong.
Do you think it's possible to speak about antisemitism in Russia nowadays without talking about the growing xenophobia? For example, a lot of young Tajik girls were attacked by skinheads last year, and the hooligans killed them, were just exculpated. And I think the Jews are not the main target today.
Yeah, I think it's part of a larger xenophobia that's not just in Russia, but it's in Germany, it's in Hungary.
Yes, but especially in Russia, against Caucasian people.
Absolutely. The Caucasians who are referred to as Chon, the blacks. They're referred to as the blacks. Yes, exactly. And actually, I think Jews are slightly more appealing than the Tajiks, the Chechens. They won't let me wear a particular hat that I have because they say I look like a Chechen bandit in the hat. But yes, this growing xenophobia. But the xenophobia is hand in hand with the nationalism and the rejection of the West, and a feeling that Russia has been brought to its knees by the West, by America in particular, which did nothing to help reconstruct the country. So all of these are interlocking parts.
In Soviet times, there were powerful organizations that were advocates of the Jews that suffered in the Soviet Union, helped them get out, et cetera, et cetera. Who are the advocates today for the people that suffer? The Caucasians, the Georgians who are being deported, the Chechens who are victimized in Kareli this summer during the nationalist uprising there. Who are their advocates?
In Russia?
No, here in the West.
Here?
In Germany.
Almost
America.
nobody. I mean, how much reporting on the Chechen War have you seen in the American history? I was at a meeting at the Carnegie Council on Foreign Relations when this man from the Jamestown Foundation gave a paper on what amounts to mass murder by the Russian army in Chechnya. And Kitty Pilgrim of CNN was there. And she said to him, what should we do? What should the media do to report this? He said, well, just tell the truth. Just send a camera down. Just have somebody with some experience get on and tell the story of what is going on in Chechnya. I watched assiduously for weeks Kitty Pilgrim, and there was nothing, there wasn't a word about Chechnya and what is going on in Chechnya. And I don't know who is speaking about it. I don't think anybody, frankly, is. There has been very little about these kinds of matters reported in the American press about Russia, and I believe that too is largely political. For instance, when the Chechen War, when there was the Battle of Grozny in, I think it was 1992 or 3 or something like this, it was reported in the New York Times. There was an interview with the general, I'll never forget this, an interview with the Russian general who said the Battle of Grozny is over and we have won. At the time I was subscribing to Omri, which is a news service, international news service, that printed the entirety of the Russian general's interview, which was, the Battle of Grozny is over, we have won, but I know in my heart that a long and bloody and murderous guerrilla war is about to start. And the New York Times just left that out. They just cut it off in mid-phrase. Why did they do that? They couldn't put it on the page, all the news that fits. It was quite obviously political. Why? Because they don't want to stir people up. And probably.
Chechens align themselves with radical Islam. It's more complex than that.
Well, but not then, not at that time, not really, not at that time. At least, maybe they had, but.
Putin flirts with Israel for that reason.
Yeah. No, I understand that.
Not just in Chechnya, South Korea.
Yeah, today that's the case, but it wasn't the case at that time. But I don't know what human rights organizations are really looking carefully at the situation in Russia. Russia's been sort of forgotten. I was speaking to a former head of Army intelligence and worked under Brezhnev in the National Security Council in the Carter administration. And he speaks Russian fluently, and we published his books on Russia and so on and so forth. And this was in the early 90s, and I said to him, Bill, what do you think about what's going on in Russia? He said, Russia does not matter. Russia does not matter. And I believe that has been a feeling in our State Department once we, quote-unquote, won the Cold War. Russia doesn't matter, but Russia matters. And Russia will matter more and more because they have more nuclear missiles and warheads than any other country in the world except for the United States.
And lots of oil.
And lots of oil. And they're right on the doorstep of Europe. And I believe that this is something that the West needs to pay much more attention to.
Your own company was cited this weekend as the best investment of all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which company is that?
Not from an investment
I think it's
perspective. It's what?
Yukos.
Yes.
Oh. Lukoil has a big advertisement at the time.
Sure.
Thank you very much for all of this information. I think you're right that I'm left with the feeling of I need some way to evaluate all of it. And I'm wondering if there's anybody who's doing serious work in political science or in sociology about the nature of anti-Semitism in Russia, because you are perfectly right. What people do with anti-Semitic images and who's profiting from the usage of the images. And you could even, I could construct a scenario in which it's to the advantage of Putin's government to keep anti-Semitism under control and to allow
But to not, exactly, not to let it go away.
Yes, not, it should be there, but,
To manage it.
but it has to be managed.
Exactly.
It should be managed.
It's part
So
of that
what-
organized plan.
So I'm wondering, is there any work that's being done in Russia now by people on the ground?
I don't know of any, and certainly no such manuscript proposal or research project has come across my desk, because it would be very interesting. The problem is that Russia is in a state of transition, the world is in a state of violent transition, and it's very difficult to know where we are. You know, I keep thinking of Schnitzler's The Road to the Open, that he wrote in 1906, I believe. What an unbelievably prescient novel. What an unbelievable work that was. And in 1906, when he talks about the extermination of the Jews, and you know, people laugh. What are you talking about? It's insane. It will never happen. It cannot happen. Well, there it was. But you know, or Isaac Babel in 1920, writing this extraordinary note in his diary, he says, "Can it be that ours is the century in which they all perish?" About the Jews of Russia in 1920, because what he was witnessing in front of him was the utter extermination of the people. But it was too soon. So I think, you know, in some odd and unfortunate way, it's too soon right now. We don't know. We don't know if Russia is going to get back on its legs. We don't know if some wonderful innovation in technology is going to make oil irrelevant. We don't know. We don't know. And so it's a question mark. And it would be great if there were some. I know there is a group, there are these groups in Russia now that are and largely Jewish groups, that are trying to recapture the history, that are trying to consolidate some picture of what is going on. But it's very scattered. Yes.
Was it noticed in Russia? Do people know that, I presume it's true that more than half of the Jews left in the 1990s to go to Israel? Do people know that? And how is that thought of?
People know it.
Or is everybody left, not just the Jews? But
Nobody said how it's thought of. I mean, I know some anecdotes, but they're nothing but anecdotes. If you want to hear them, I'll be happy to tell them. But for instance, this friend of mine, he's a Narodny artist, a great film star, Igor Kostelevsky, Marina's cousin. And this must remain confidential. But he was invited to play the Tsar in a remake of War and Peace by an Italian film crew. And they are going to co-produce it with a Russian company. But when this Russian company found out that Igor was Jewish, it took 4 months of negotiating to convince them that he could play this role. 4 months of negotiating that he could play this role. I have a friend who was the former head of publications of the Comintern archive, who was asked in the 90s to appear on television, Russian television, to speak about Stalin's crimes. And his last name is perfectly Russian, Firsov. Good Russian name. It happens his mother was Jewish, and his father was Russian. And he looks as Russian as Isaac Babel looked. So anyhow, he comes on television and he's about to start talking about Stalin's crimes, the producer is shocked to see this Jewish face on the screen, and he cancels the show. It was a live show. It was a live show. Nobody could understand why he blacked it out, but he could not have that, you see. He could not have that. And so, there, as you were saying, it's not over. It's not over. It will never be over. It will never be over. But how it will end, we don't know. Maybe. Some people say this, some people don't.
This is Russia.
Okay.
So this is okay. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. And just to let you know, next week there is not a seminar. On November the 2nd, we're at Hacking. Novelist will speak about growing up Jewish in Iran and about the situation of the Jewish community in Tehran.
I would like, if possible, to get some of those documents back.
Oh, yeah.
I need it for my
Chocolate.